Hello everyone. In this lecture, I will be going over our study topic for Class 1, Federal Tax Authority, Procedures, and Individual Taxation. Everybody knows what taxes are, and we all understand that governments need funding in order to conduct their own operations, in order to legislate, and in order to essentially function as entities. And in our country, in the USA, we have federal, state, and local governments. Each of these levels of government have the power to tax, and these taxes can come in the form of income tax, payroll tax, property tax, sales tax. You may have also heard of capital gains taxes, dividends, there's gift tax, as well as various other fees that are levied on both individuals and businesses in order to keep the government running. For this unit, we'll be focusing mainly on the federal government and its tax authority, and this class will be divided into three sections. In the first section, we'll be looking at the overall tax authoritative hierarchy that the federal government holds in order to tax individuals and businesses. In the second section, we'll be looking at the procedures that that authority requires. And then in the third section, we'll be looking at strategies and different issues that may arise when a CPA or another type of financial professional is advising his or her clients in terms of tax planning in order to essentially provide the best services possible with a full understanding of what the law requires. Tax planning is a continuous process of analyzing options available for a business or individual that will minimize tax liabilities, but it's usually done in a way that maintains the overall objective of maximizing after tax income. So, in other words, it's a lot of what a financial professional does is try to figure out how to reduce the amount of taxes that an individual or a company may have to pay. And that's what distinguishes between a good financial professional and a not so good financial professional. Moving on. Here we have the authoritative hierarchy for federal tax law and its authority to tax. It's composed of legislative, administrative, and judicial tax law. I'm not going to go into detail about this tax authority hierarchy here because we're going to be covering this in the next few slides. But all you have to take away from this is simply that the U.S. Constitution is the source of authority for all of the various, agencies and courts that are part of our federal government as a whole. I'm sure you're familiar with our three branches of government. So this chart simply highlights the U.S. Constitution as the basis of the tax authority power that the federal government has in order for it to levy taxes. So what's important to keep in mind here is that when there are conflicting sources of tax law, whether it be written in a vague way by Congress or interpreted in a siloed manner by a court or enforced by a federal agency in an arbitrary manner, sometimes these sources of tax law, because they're split between the three branches of government, can conflict. when this occurs, then we look at this chart to determine whether or not these conflicting sources of tax law fall within the same tier. And if they do, we take the most recent rule or law as precedence. So going into a little bit more detail about legislative law and the tax authority basis in the legislature is simply that legislation is the laws that Congress passes through a vote in the bicameral House, which is comprised of the House of Representatives and the Senators. So Congress in 1986 passed the Internal Revenue Code, and this, we call it the IRC, is found at Title VI of the United States Code. So essentially is all of the taxes that we are familiar with, such as income, estate, gift, employment, excise, taxes, all of these are provisions that are included in the IRC. So, as long as the IRC has not been struck down by the Supreme Court, then every section of the IRC is binding on the Supreme Court, and by default, all of the federal courts that sit underneath the U.S. Supreme Court. Keep in mind, this is all federal. We're not going into state legislation or state judicial law or even state administrative law. This is all federal. So committee reports are essentially reports that senators or congressmen, they will issue when they are either debating or they pass a new statute or law. And sometimes when there's a dispute or a claim made by either a private citizen or a state government or a business against the government for, let's say, taking too much taxes or unfairly penalizing them through enforcement based upon a tax issue, then sometimes these committee reports are very useful to determine the congressional intent behind whatever law is being implicated in that instance. Usually, congressional intent is very, very helpful because sometimes a law is written in a way in which it's very vague, It might be something general, it might be like 2 or 3 sentences within a provision. Maybe it's it's language that's written in a way where the executive branch doesn't have a clear history or legal precedent in order to actually enforce a provision. In these cases, the congressional intent can determine what was Congress's intent in passing that specific provision. And a lot of the time, determining congressional intent helps not only the executive branch officials, but also the judges to analyze and interpret these specific tax law provisions. So administrative law is the executive branch of our federal government. And essentially, it's a catch-all term for all of the rules and regulations that are implemented by the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department in this case is integral because the statute that I mentioned in the previous slide, the IRC of 1986, that law written within its provisions specifically delegates statutory authority to levy and collect taxes onto the U.S. Treasury Department. So the IRS, also the Internal Revenue Service, I'm sure you're all familiar with that, is the Chief Enforcement Bureau of the Treasury Department. So what happens is when the IRC passes, there has to be enforcement, and it is the IRS, and specifically the Office of Chief Counsel, that will write what we call administrative tax law. So, administrative tax law is approved by the Secretary of the Treasury, who's the top level executive branch official within that executive department, and they are a cabinet level position. And the Secretary of the Treasury is the one that can issue like regulations, revenue rulings, revenue procedure statements, private letter rulings, technical advice memoranda, and internal revenue bulletins, as well as various other publications. You don't have to worry too much about knowing what these things are within the IRS's authority. Just remember that if it's not something that's based in the judicial branch or a court, and if it's not based in a reading of the statute or the law, which is the legislative branch, then everything else falls within the administrative law, which is the executive branch, and specifically the Treasury Department. So, lastly, judicial law refers to common law that originates from the federal court system, and it's primarily comprised of opinions. So, what happens is, as the IRC got passed, and the federal government pretty much laid out all of the rules and provisions that govern, like the definitions of what, like how a tax is defined, and the procedures, and then the IRS then fleshes that out more in a more detailed way. The judicial branch is the one that essentially hears disputes, and they pretty much within our judicial branch system, you see here on this diagram, it's the Supreme Court that sits at the very top, with the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the federal court. And then underneath that are the tax court, the district court, and the court of federal claims. So this is divided into the appellate level and the trial level. And this is essentially like an area that you would have to become more familiar with if you were practicing as an attorney, because typically if you would be representing a certain client, you may have to argue against the government for unfair application of taxes or unfair penalties, or you might be disputing a liability ruling. In those instances, you would start from the trial court and you would move your way up, provided, of course, that you have a case that those higher level courts are willing to essentially hear